In February of 1981, Phil Ford drove toward the basket, and an opponent's thumb struck him in the eye. The collision required surgery. Ford returned to basketball, but the fearless point guard who had lived in traffic no longer felt the same when bodies closed around him. One ordinary play had attacked the exact instinct his game needed most. Only weeks earlier, Ford had scored a career-high 38 points. 2 years before that, he had received 62 of 66 votes for Rookie of the Year and made the All-NBA second team as a first-year player. Kansas City appeared to have found its floor general for the next decade. Instead, Ford was out of the NBA before his 30th birthday. The cruelest detail came while he was recovering. A Kansas City team that finished 40-42 reached the conference finals without him. Ford had helped transform the franchise, then watched its deepest playoff run unfold from the outside. When he came back, declining production and a growing personal struggle followed him from city to city. That is why Phil Ford's career did not end in one spectacular collapse. The injury changed how he attacked. The confidence eroded. Alcohol later became a serious problem that he has discussed openly. By 1985, a player once spoken about as the future of his position had completed only 482 NBA games. To understand what was lost, the story has to go back to Rocky Mount, North Carolina, and to a boy who became one of the greatest college guards his conference had ever seen. His professional decline is only half the life. The other half is how he found his way back to basketball after the playing career and personal stability had both slipped away. Phil Jackson Ford Jr. was born on the 9th of February, 1956, in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. Picture the place and the time. The American South in the mid-50s, still living under segregation, still carrying all the weight that came with it. And in the middle of it, a state absolutely obsessed with basketball, where the game on the court could feel like the one place a kid's gifts spoke louder than anything else. Ford's gift was a particular kind of gift. He wasn't built to be a flashy gunner who lived for his own shot. He was a pure point guard before that phrase became fashionable. A player whose genius was control and vision, the ability to see the whole floor a half second before anyone else did and put the ball exactly where it needed to be. He made the men around him better. That was his identity. That was his fingerprint on every game he touched. Ford's control did not come from standing safely outside the defense. He created it by entering the space where larger bodies converged, making one defender commit, and releasing the ball at the instant a teammate became free. The point guard's vision and his willingness to use it in traffic were part of the same gift. He came up through Rocky Mount Senior High School, graduating in 1974, already a name that college recruiters in a basketball-mad state could not ignore. And one program, one man in particular, would shape not just his career, but the entire arc of his life. That man was Dean Smith. Now, Smith would become far more than a coach to Phil Ford. He'd become the person Ford turned to in his darkest hours, the steady voice he reached for when everything else had fallen apart. But that's down the road. In the fall of 1974, when this kid from Rocky Mount walked onto the North Carolina campus, Dean Smith was about to do something he had never done before: break one of his own oldest, most stubborn rules. And he was going to break it for a freshman. You have to understand who Dean Smith was to understand the size of this. Smith was famous, almost notorious, for making players earn everything. You didn't walk in and start at North Carolina. You waited your turn. You proved it. That was the culture, and it had stood for years. Then came Phil Ford, and Dean Smith looked at this freshman and did something unprecedented. He made Ford the first freshman ever to start his very first collegiate game under him. For a coach who guarded his rules like scripture, that one decision said more than any press conference ever could. He believed. Ford rewarded that belief immediately. As a freshman, he averaged 16.4 points and 5.2 assists, both North Carolina freshman records that survived for more than 20 years. Generations of talented teenagers passed through Chapel Hill before anyone displaced what Ford established at 18. Then came the 1975 ACC tournament, and that's where the legend really caught fire. North Carolina State had been ruling the conference, champions 2 years running. Ford and the Tar Heels broke that streak. And Ford didn't just contribute. He detonated, averaging 26 points across the tournament and walking off as most valuable player. The first freshman in the entire history of the ACC to be named tournament MVP. Nobody had ever done it. A teenager did it, so everything was pointing up. The records, the honors, the belief of a coaching legend. But the moment that still wakes Phil Ford in the night, more than 40 years later, isn't one of these triumphs. It's a loss. A championship game he played with an injured arm, a defeat he has said he still relives in his sleep. Fast forward to Ford's junior year, and he carried North Carolina deep, all the way to the Final Four and into the national championship game. But he carried them hurt. In the regional semifinal against Notre Dame, Ford hyperextended his shooting elbow, the very arm he needed to score, to create, to be himself. Compromised at the worst possible time. He played through it anyway. That's who he was. And in the 1977 NCAA championship game, North Carolina fell to Marquette. Ford gutted his way through that game on a damaged elbow, and they came up short. Now here's the human detail that tells you everything about the man. More than 4 decades later, Phil Ford has described that loss as a recurring nightmare. Not a disappointment he shrugged off, not a footnote. A nightmare that comes back to him again and again across the span of a lifetime. The moment revealed a pattern that would matter later. Phil Ford absorbed pain quietly. He played hurt and carried disappointment inward, sometimes for decades. That instinct looked like toughness while the games continued. After a much more serious injury arrived, the same silence left the frustration with nowhere healthy to go. He would leave Carolina as the greatest scorer the school had ever produced. But even that towering record came with a hidden expiration date, one that wouldn't arrive for another 31 years. By his senior season, Phil Ford had become something close to royalty in North Carolina basketball. In his final home game, he poured in a career-high 34 points, and he did it in a win over Duke, of all teams, which only made it sweeter for everyone wearing Carolina blue. And then came the avalanche of national honors. Ford swept Player of the Year awards across the board: the United States Basketball Writers Association, the National Association of Basketball Coaches, the Sporting News, and the John R. Wooden Award. When the people who watched the college game closest sat down to name the best player in America, they kept landing on the same answer: Phil Ford. He left Chapel Hill as the all-time leading scorer in school history, with 2,290 points, and held school and ACC career records with 753 assists. Those marks were eventually surpassed. Tyler Hansbrough broke the scoring record in December of 2008, and later guards moved beyond Ford's assist total. But for decades, those numbers defined the standard at North Carolina. But that takes nothing away from what those numbers meant in their moment. For years, Phil Ford was simply the standard at North Carolina, the man every guard who followed measured himself again. Saint. The school retired his number 12, lifting it up where it would hang permanently, a quiet promise that no matter what records fell, this one was his. He was widely regarded as one of the finest college point guards ever to play the game, with some insisting he was the greatest guard his conference had ever seen. And in 1978, that resume pointed straight at the NBA. The pros were calling. But the road from Chapel Hill to the professional game wasn't going to be smooth, because before Phil Ford ever played a single minute for the team that drafted him, he was going to tell them, flat out, that he didn't want to come. Before the holdout, before the NBA ever entered the picture, Phil Ford had already done something most college players only dream about. After his sophomore season at North Carolina, He found himself wearing the red, white, and blue, named the starting point guard for the United States Olympic team at the 1976 Games. And here's the detail that makes it almost poetic. The man coaching that Olympic team was none other than Dean Smith. So the same coach who'd broken his own rules to start a freshman in Chapel Hill now handed that same young man the keys to a national team on the world stage. That tells you everything about the trust between them. When the stakes were highest, when the whole country was watching, Smith looked down his bench and put the ball in Phil Ford's hands. Ford delivered exactly what he always delivered: control. Across 6 Olympic Games, he averaged 9 assists a contest. 9. That wasn't a scorer padding his own numbers. That was a distributor running an offense, finding teammates, conducting the whole thing like an orchestra. The United States walked away with the gold medal, and Ford walked away having proven that his gift translated to any level, against any competition the world could throw at him. The bond underneath those victories became the spine of the larger story. Phil Ford and Dean Smith won at the college and international levels. Years after the cheering stopped, they would face a crisis no game plan could solve. The coach who trusted Ford with the ball as a teenager remained present when Ford could no longer direct his own life with the same certainty. That, though, was still a long way off. 2 years after Montreal, an NBA franchise in Kansas City made it crystal clear it would do almost anything to draft him. And Phil Ford made it just as clear that he didn't want to go. The 1978 NBA draft set up like a sure thing. Kansas City held the number 2 overall pick, and the franchise made no secret of who it wanted. Phil Ford was the target. There was no mystery, no draft night suspense. Everyone in the building knew the plan. There was just one problem. The player they wanted didn't want them back. The stand was unusual for a top 2 pick with no professional experience. Instead of simply celebrating, Ford warned Kansas City that it might never see him in its uniform and backed the statement with a holdout. Rookies were expected to accept the destination chosen for them. Ford tested how much leverage even an unproven star could create. But Kansas City wouldn't blink. The franchise refused every trade offer that came across the table. They had decided he was their man, and they were prepared to wait him out. And in the end, the standoff resolved the way these things usually do, with a signature. By the end of September of 1978, the contract dispute was over. Phil Ford was, whether he'd wanted it or not, a member of the Kansas City Kings. Here's the part that history loves. The reluctant draftee who'd publicly declared he didn't want this city was about to turn around and give that very city the single greatest rookie season it had ever seen. Whatever reluctance Phil Ford carried into Kansas City, it vanished the moment the ball went up. He stepped onto an NBA floor as a rookie and played like he'd been running the league for years. The numbers tell the first part of the story. 15.9 points a game, 8.6 assists a game. And he didn't do it alone. He formed a dynamic backcourt with Otis Birdsong under coach Cotton Fitzsimmons, the two of them giving opposing guards absolute fits. Ford ran the show, Birdsong scored in bunches, and Kansas City suddenly had one of the most exciting young backcourts in basketball. Then came the hardware. Ford was named Rookie of the Year, and not in some close contested vote. He took 62 of the 66 ballots cast, a near-unanimous landslide. The basketball world had looked at every first-year player in the league and pointed, almost as one, at the guard from Rocky Mount. And it didn't stop there. Ford was also named to the All-NBA second team that season. As a rookie. To put that in perspective, making an All-NBA team in your very first year is something only a tiny handful of players have ever pulled off in NBA history. That's not a list you stumble onto. That's a list reserved for players who look like they're going to define the position for a decade. But the clearest proof of his impact wasn't a personal award at all. It was what happened to the team around him. The season before Ford arrived, Kansas City won 31 games. With him running the floor, they jumped to 48 wins, a leap so large it earned them a bye straight to the Western Conference semifinals. One man, 17 more wins. That's the kind of difference a true floor general makes. And then, one night in February of 1979, against the Milwaukee Bucks, Phil Ford did something on a basketball court that showed exactly how high his ceiling really was. A performance so complete, it makes everything that came later that much harder to explain. It was the 21st of February, 1979. Milwaukee was in town, and Phil Ford put together one of those stat lines that stops you cold when you read it back. 22 assists, 26 points, 5 rebounds, 5 steals. In a 133-117 win. 22 assists meant that Ford repeatedly created a basket for somebody else while still scoring 26 himself and disrupting Milwaukee at the other end. It was a young point guard controlling the pace, the distribution of shots, and the pressure applied to both backcourts. And that game wasn't a fluke. It was a window into exactly who he was as a player. Phil Ford was an elite ball handler and penetrator, a guard who could break a defense down off the dribble and get wherever he wanted. He had an accurate pull-up jumper to keep defenders honest, and he was a master at drawing fouls, getting himself to the line and putting the other team in trouble. But maybe his most famous gift was what he did with the four corners offense. That patient, spread-out attack North Carolina had made legendary. Plenty of players could run it just to harm the clock. Ford ran it to score. He turned a stalling tactic into a weapon, slicing through gaps and finding open teammates instead of simply holding the ball and waiting. He made patience dangerous. The visual was unmistakable. Ford raised 4 fingers, the Tar Heels spread toward the corners, and the middle of the floor opened around him. The defense faced a bad choice. Stay back and watch the clock disappear, or step toward Ford and expose the lane behind that first movement. He changed speed without surrendering control, carried the defender toward one side, then used the empty space to penetrate, draw help, or retreat, and begin again. 5 capable ball handlers and free throw shooters made the alignment work, but Ford gave it nerve. What looked like delay was actually pressure. The longer the defense waited, the more urgently it had to chase him. That system taught him to treat the lane as a place of calculation rather than chaos. He did not enter traffic blindly. He entered because a defender's angle had already shown him where the next pass or shot would be. The same skill transferred to Kansas City, where a conventional NBA possession offered less space, but the decision remained familiar. Force the defense inward, then punish whichever player moved first. The people who watched the game closest saw it plainly. His own coach, Cotton Fitzsimmons, said it about as well as anyone could in comments that ran in the press at the time. He called Ford the best point guard playing basketball, a player who could jump up in the air, spot 3 guys open, and always give the ball to the guy with the hot hand. That's the highest praise you can give a floor general. Not that he scored, but that he saw everything. The lane connected all of those gifts. It was where Ford's handle became penetration. Penetration became a foul or a rotating defender, and rotation became an open teammate. Weeks after his greatest scoring night, an ordinary play would make that familiar space feel physically different. If you wanted to pick the moment Phil Ford stood at the absolute summit of his powers, you could make a strong case for the 23rd of January, 1981. That night, against the Houston Rockets, Ford caught fire and poured in a career-high 38 points in a 113-107 Kansas City win. 38. For a guard whose whole identity was built around setting up everyone else, this was a reminder that when he decided to take over the scoring himself, he absolutely could. He was in his prime, in full command, doing things on the floor that looked effortless. And that's what makes this date so painful in hindsight. Nobody watching that game had any reason to think the end was near. Phil Ford was 24 years old. He'd been Rookie of the Year, an All-NBA selection, an Olympic gold medalist, the heartbeat of a franchise that had leapt up the standings the moment he arrived. He'd just dropped a career high on a good team. Everything pointed up. Everything said this was a star still climbing toward his peak, with the best years still ahead of him. But this was the high water mark. This was the top of the mountain, and he had no idea. Because just weeks later, a matter of days really, in the grand scheme of a season, Phil Ford was going to be on the floor for one more ordinary play, one more collision near the basket, the kind that happens dozens of times a night in the NBA. Players bump, hands fly, bodies tangle. It looks like nothing. This collision would catch him in the worst possible place. The 38-point night against Houston was not the launch of something larger. It became the final great scoring night before Ford's relationship with traffic near the basket changed. It happened in February of 1981, an ordinary sequence in an ordinary NBA game, the kind of play that disappears from memory by the next possession. Phil Ford was guarding World B. Free, the high-scoring guard who could fill it up with the best of them. Free reached in for the ball, and his thumb went into Ford's eye. Accounts of the play said the impact dislocated Free's own thumb. The hand that struck Ford was itself damaged by the force, while Ford suffered an orbital injury serious enough to require surgery and end his season. This was not the ordinary discomfort implied by the phrase, "poked in the eye." Ford suffered a serious eye injury that required surgery. Contemporary reporting described a broken orbital bone, the delicate ring of bone surrounding the eye. No primary medical record publicly confirms every detail repeated in later retellings, so the responsible description remains the one supported at the time: a serious orbital injury requiring surgery and ending his season. For Ford, missing games was only the visible damage. His greatest strength had been entering crowded space without hesitation, forcing the defense to react and delivering the ball at exactly the right instant. After the collision, the danger near the basket was no longer theoretical, and every drive asked him to trust the same area where his career had changed. He played just 66 games that year. The surgery and the recovery cost him the rest of it. One moment, he was a 24-year-old at the peak of his powers, fresh off a 38-point career high. The next, he was on a table, then on a bench, watching his season vanish over a play that wasn't even anyone's fault. The cruelest competitive twist followed while Ford recovered. Kansas City did not collapse without its injured point guard. The Kings began the deepest playoff run in franchise history. Let me set the scene, because the math alone tells you how unlikely this was. The Kings finished that regular season at 40 wins and 42 losses. A losing record, below 500, the kind of team that, on paper, has no business going anywhere in the postseason. And they'd lost Phil Ford to the eye injury. Then, to make it worse, his backcourt partner Otis Birdsong went down injured too. Both starting guards, gone. By every logic of basketball, this team should have been swept aside quietly. Instead, they caught fire. In the first round, the Kings survived a series against Portland, hanging on, finding a way, doing it without the floor general who'd lifted them 17 wins just 2 seasons earlier. And then came the second round, and a Phoenix Suns team that had won 57 games that year. 57, a genuine powerhouse. Kansas City took them to 7 games and won. They knocked off the mighty Suns and marched all the way to the Western Conference Finals, a 40-42 team. In the conference finals, largely without their Rookie of the Year point guard. Ford watched the run while healing from surgery. It did not prove that Kansas City was better without him. Playoff series, matchups, and replacement performances do not offer conclusions that simple. But for a point guard whose identity rested on making a team function, the timing was brutal. His teammates were discovering how far they could advance while he had no way to influence a possession. Ford later said he did not handle the aftermath correctly. The team's success may have sharpened the isolation, but the most direct change was physical and immediate. The area of the court he had trusted since North Carolina was now associated with surgery and a season ending in an instant. After the injury, Ford said he was no longer comfortable driving into the lane. The change can be pictured in a decision that occurs dozens of times during a game. A defender turns his hips and a narrow seam appears. Before the collision, Ford attacked that shoulder, entered the paint, and made the second defender choose between the ball and a teammate. Afterward, the same opening carried another calculation. Pull up, move the ball early, or enter the crowd and expose the repaired eye again. A hesitation of half a second was enough to let the seam close. He could still recognize the rotation and deliver a pass, but the action that forced the rotation occurred less naturally. The numbers eventually reflected the difference. Ford had averaged between 15.9 and 17.5 points during his peak Kansas City seasons. In 1981 to 82, he fell to 9.9. The decline cannot be assigned to one imagined possession, but its shape matches his own account. The point guard still understood the game while no longer attacking its most crowded space with the same truce. And Ford has been honest about this part, looking back across the years. He said that he suffered the serious injury during an NBA game and that he didn't handle the aftermath the right way, that the way he responded to it ultimately derailed his professional basketball career and very nearly his life. That admission is the hinge of this entire story. Because up to this point, you could tell it as a basketball tragedy, a great player undone by a freak collision. But Ford himself points past the basketball towards something heavier waiting on the other side. What the public didn't fully understand yet was that behind the declining numbers, the whispers were already starting. Whispers about alcohol, whispers about effort, whispers about a player who seemed to have lost his fire. This is where the story gets delicate and where we have to be careful and fair, because there are two distinct chapters here that are easy to blur together, and blurring them would do Phil Ford a disservice. During his later playing years, Ford was dogged by accusations of alcoholism. That's the word the press used at the time. Reporting from around February of 1984 laid it out plainly, accusations swirling alongside questions about his work ethic and his ability following the eye injury. And here's the crucial part. At the time, Ford denied it. He pushed back against the accusations as they were being made. So I want to be precise about the timeline, because precision matters when a man's reputation is on the line. There is the period during his career when allegations were aimed at him and he denied them. And there is a separate later period, years down the road, when Ford himself would openly speak about his battle with alcohol, confirming a struggle in his own words and on his own terms. Those are two different moments. One is an accusation he rejected as it happened. The other is a confession he chose to share once he'd come through the other side. To collapse them into a single story is to miss the entire human arc of it. But even in the middle of the whispers, you can see Ford reaching for a lifeline. Around that same stretch, he spoke about going back to Chapel Hill and getting into the best shape of his life. And he described sitting down with the one man who'd always anchored him, Dean Smith, and Smith asking him a question that cuts far deeper than basketball ever could. He asked Ford what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. That's not a coaching question. That's the question you ask a man you're worried about. And it tells you that the people closest to Phil Ford could already see what the box scores were only beginning to hint at. The career was slipping. But something larger was slipping too, and the basketball part of the story still had its final sad act to play out, across 3 more cities, in a uniform that kept changing. When a great player starts to decline, the league has a quiet, business-like way of moving him along. There's no announcement, no ceremony, just a series of transactions, each one a little smaller than the last, until one day the player simply isn't on a roster anymore. For Phil Ford, the long goodbye ran through 3 cities. After he struggled to recover the level he had once played at, Kansas City traded him to the New Jersey Nets. He didn't last long there. Just 7 games into the next season, the Nets shipped him to the Milwaukee Bucks. His time in Milwaukee lasted only that single season, and then, for the 1983-84 campaign, he caught on with the Houston Rockets, the very team he dropped that career-high 38 points on, back when the whole league was still his for the taking. There's a bitter symmetry in that. The Rockets had been the backdrop of his greatest scoring night. Now they were the final stop, the place where the story quietly ran out of road. And the numbers by the end tell you just how far he'd fallen from the player he'd been. In that last season with Houston, in 1984-85, Phil Ford averaged just 1.8 points a game across 25 appearances. 1.8. From a near-unanimous Rookie of the Year, an All-NBA selection, an Olympic gold medalist, down to a few minutes here and there, a deep reserve hanging on at the edge of a roster. When you add it all up, the full career line reads 482 games, 5,594 points, an average of 11.6 a game with 3,083 assists. Respectable numbers, solid numbers. But not the numbers of the player everyone expected back in 1979, and everybody watching knew it. In 1985, Phil Ford retired from the NBA. He was 29 years old. The basketball was over. But the hardest part of his story wasn't on any court, and it wasn't finished. The whispers had been pointing at something real all along. And the man who'd internalized every loss since that 1977 championship game was about to come to the very bottom, to a night, alone, that would finally force everything he'd been holding inside out into the open. So here's a man, not yet 30, walking away from the only thing he'd ever truly mastered. No locker room waiting for him in the fall. No game to channel everything into. And all that pain he'd been swallowing since college. The championship that haunted him. The injury that stole his nerve. The slow indignity of being shuffled from city to city. It didn't disappear when the basketball stopped. It had nowhere left to go. Ford has spoken openly, years later, about what came next. In his own account, shared in his own words, he succumbed to alcohol. This isn't a tabloid whisper or an anonymous accusation from a press box. This is a man who, long after the storm had passed, chose to tell the truth about the lowest stretch of his life. And the truth was hard. He battled to stay sober and kept losing the battle. The grip kept tightening. He has described the breaking point in stark, simple terms, a night when the weight of it all dropped him to his knees, when he cried out to God because he had run out of every other answer. This was not the Olympian, the near-unanimous award winner, or the man who once owned every inch of an NBA floor. It was a person at the absolute end of himself, on the ground, with nothing left to lean on. That night was the turning point, but not because everything fixed itself in an instant. It didn't. What that moment did was crack him open enough to let help in. And the help came in pieces. Counseling, meetings, the quiet rooms where people sit in folding chairs and admit out loud what they can no longer carry alone. And one familiar voice from across the years, Dean Smith, the man Ford described as deeply spiritual, the same coach who'd once asked him what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. Now that question had teeth. Now it was the whole ballgame. Smith's support went beyond offering a job or repeating a coach's familiar encouragement. As Ford worked toward sobriety, Smith learned the 12 steps used in recovery programs so he could understand the language and process his former point guard was being asked to follow. The detail fits everything Ford had known about him. Smith had once studied every movement of the four corners so Ford would know which decision came next. Now he studied a different set of steps because the stakes were no longer a possession or championship. The coach was trying to help the man survive the part of life that basketball could not organize for him. And the place that would help pull him back from the edge was the very place that had made his name in the first place. Because in 1988, Phil Ford was going home to Carolina. In 1988, Ford returned to North Carolina, not as a player, but as an assistant coach. He held that position through the year 2000 while privately fighting the hardest battle of his life. Recovery was not one dramatic night. It was 1,000 quiet mornings of choosing to stay standing. Ford was building a coaching career in public while rebuilding a man in private. and the public side delivered something close to vindication. In 1993, Ford helped lead the Tar Heels to a national championship. Picture the symmetry of that. The man whose own college career ended with a title game heartbreak he still relived in his nightmares. Now standing on the bench as Carolina cut down the nets, a champion at last, just on the other side of the clipboard. When Dean Smith retired in 1997, the program turned to Bill Guthridge, and Ford became his top assistant, part of a staff that pushed all the way to a Final Four in the year 2000. The boy from Rocky Mount had become one of the steady hands holding up the most storied program in the sport. The recovery inside that coaching career was not a clean upward line. In October of 1999, Ford took medical leave and entered a residential treatment program for alcohol abuse. When he completed the program, university health professionals recommended that he return to work with modified duties while continuing intensive outpatient treatment under supervision. He resumed coaching in November. That sequence matters because it replaces the easy version of redemption with the real one. A person can return home, win a championship from the bench, mentor young players, and still need formal treatment years later. Progress did not mean the struggle had vanished. It meant Ford finally kept accepting help when the struggle returned. North Carolina's response also mattered. The program did not describe treatment as a moral failure or use it as a reason to erase everything Ford had contributed. It created a supervised path back to daily life and work. For someone whose playing career had taught him how quickly an organization could move on when production disappeared, returning under those conditions offered a different lesson. Value could survive vulnerability. But Ford has always been clear about where the real rescue came from, and it wasn't a job title or a championship banner. He has said plainly that it wasn't until he turned his life back to God that he was finally freed from the grip of alcohol. In his own words, "I've been very fortunate since I've turned my life over to Jesus Christ." For a lot of folks watching this, folks who've walked through their own valleys, who've leaned on faith to climb back out, that sentence lands with a particular weight. It's not a slogan, it's a man telling you what saved him. And his journey in the game was far from finished. The next stop would carry him back into the NBA, onto benches shared with two of the biggest and most talked about names the league has ever produced. The professional game called Phil Ford back, not as the star this time, but as the trusted voice beside the head coach. And the company he kept tells you how much respect his basketball mind still commanded. From 2004 to 2005, Ford worked as an assistant under Larry Brown with the Detroit Pistons, Brown being one of the most respected and restless coaching minds the sport has ever known. Then, from 2005 to 2007, Ford joined Isaiah Thomas's staff with the New York Knicks, sitting on the bench in the brightest, loudest media market in America. And later, from 2008 to 2010, he reunited with Larry Brown again, this time with the Charlotte Bobcats. Detroit, New York, Charlotte, a real second basketball life built entirely on the knowledge and the eye that the eye injury could never take from him. They stole his drive to the basket. They never touched his understanding of the game. That understanding had been built from the point guard's view. Ford knew how one defender leaning too far could open the weak side, how pace could be changed without calling a new play, and how a young guard's mistake often began several seconds before the turnover everyone noticed. As a player, he had expressed that knowledge with the ball. As a coach, he could stop a practice, name the decision, and give it to somebody whose body still allowed him to execute it. The skill had changed form rather than disappeared, and along the way, the honors arrived to confirm what people had always known about his place in history. In May of 1991, Phil Ford was inducted into the North Carolina Sports Hall of Fame. Then, in 2002, he was named to the ACC 50th Anniversary Team, recognized among the 50 greatest players in the entire history of that conference. Decades after his final college game, the people charged with measuring greatness still couldn't leave his name off the list. In the years that followed his coaching career, Ford stayed close to the school that shaped him, associated with the university's athletic fundraising efforts, and at one point, lending his voice as a color commentator on Carolina broadcasts. The exact shape of those later roles has shifted over time, the way these things do, but the through line never changed. Whatever the title, Phil Ford kept finding his way back to Carolina blue. So now we've got the whole picture in front of us. The records that fell and the records that were honored. The gold medal, the lost decade in between, the collapse and the climb back. Which brings us finally to the question this whole story has been circling from the very start. When everything is laid on the table, what do we actually call the life of Phil Ford? Phil Ford's story was never a simple scandal or a single public collapse. It was a brilliant player diminished by one accidental collision, followed by a personal struggle that deepened as his basketball identity disappeared. The decline happened slowly enough that people could keep assuming he would recover until the NBA career was already over. The professional record therefore carries two truths. Ford was a near-unanimous Rookie of the Year and an All-NBA selection whose peak barely lasted 3 seasons. He also played only 482 NBA games and never became the decade-long star his arrival promised. The injury explains much of the change, but it does not make the lost years less painful. His college legacy never needed repair. Ford left North Carolina as its leading scorer, directed Dean Smith's Four Corners offense with rare control, won Olympic gold, and eventually had number 12 retired. He remained, for many people who saw him, the standard by which ACC point guards were measured. The fuller victory came after the playing stopped. Ford acknowledged the drinking problem, accepted help, and returned to North Carolina as a coach. From there, he reached championship benches, Final Fours, and NBA staffs in Detroit, New York, and Charlotte. The eye injury had damaged his confidence attacking the basket. It never touched his understanding of the game. The final image should not be the thumb striking his eye. It should be Phil Ford in Carolina blue, looking at a floor he once controlled by raising 4 fingers. Above that floor hangs number 12, protected from every changing statistic and every difficult year that followed. Below it stands the same point guard in another role, teaching players to recognize the opening before it closes. The young Ford looked capable of running the NBA for a decade. That future disappeared near the rim, and the life that followed demanded a kind of control no offense could teach, admitting the problem, accepting treatment, returning after setbacks, and allowing other people to help. His playing career became shorter than expected. His connection to basketball lasted much longer. He did not recover the fearless drive that once carried him through traffic. He recovered a place in the game, a community willing to receive him, and a way to use everything the injury had failed to take.